Hi. We continue in the flood story today in Genesis 7, and today we're going to look at the first 10 verses, 7, 1 to 10, which if you look on the right side of the screen at the chart of the traditional separation of Genesis 6 to 9 into what used to be called J, now is often called non-P versions, and the P flood stories, you can see that the last time we were in the section on the right column there where it says P version 6, 9 to 22, and you can see that section ends with Noah did this, he did all that God commanded, and what he was commanded to do was to build the ark and to bring a pair of each of the animals onto the ark with them along with his wife and his sons wives. Now we look at 7, 1 to 10, and we have a little bit of a problem. As you can see on the left side in the J version, 7, 1 to 5 is described as J, but what about 7, 6? Then you have to go back over to the right side. The P version is allegedly 7, 6 because of the description of Noah 600 years old. Then back to J for 7, 7. Then back to P, which is not on my screen, for 7, 8 to 9. Then back to J for 7, 10. Then back to P for 7, 11. And then back to J for 7, 12. We're only going to do first 10 verses today. So what do we make out of that? I don't want to spend a lot of time on these videos belaboring points that scholars argue about more now than ever about trying to attribute these verses to one source or another. But I do want to highlight two perspectives on this as any readers go through this, because we have to deal with a couple of things that seem like conflicts. So one approach, the older approach, you can see on my note in the lower left corner, and I'll bring it up farther so you can see it, from Westermann, who's one of those scholars, German scholar, who bridges the traditions between the older form and historical critical folks who are trying to really focus on sources and potential historical truth behind it, to more recent literary and other forms of reading the text. So his comment is this: R, by which he means the redactor, the person who in theory put together these different parts. So his view is R wove together only the central section of the J&P flood narratives, i.e. the actual course of the catastrophe, leaving both introductions intact and unaltered. We suggest that this was deliberate, must let each voice speak for itself. And of course, my ellipses there highlight I'm not letting Westermann speak for himself completely either, but hopefully you can see I'm not leaving out anything important. So his view is that the redactor has allowed two different stories, voices, side by side, so that we can obviously notice them and explore that. In contrast with, say, where they're really side by side, like the Genesis 1 creation story traditionally understood as P, and the Garden of Eden story in Genesis 2 and 3 traditionally understood as J, or now non-P. Plainly separated, not interwoven as we see these verses here. But more recently, Gordon Wenham suggests this, also writing a long commentary. As the Genesis account stands, there is no conflict between the general announcement in 6, 19, and 20 and the more detailed injunctions of 7, 2 to 3. And then he suggests the extra clean animals are for sacrifice, that you hear in 8:20, and the birds for reconnaissance. And Wenham's point is fair enough, but it raises some other questions about the sources and what the authors are expecting their audience to know as we go through this. So just to bring that to our attention, we have to pay at least some attention to that. Another thing that we've been paying attention to, and I'll bring it up here again, is how this whole section is organized. And we've been looking at three possible views. Here, the center one in purple is from Cassuto, two sets of 6 paragraphs. So we'd be in the third paragraph of the first section, Acts of Divine Justice, and the second set being Acts of Divine Compassion. Then there's two alternative chiastic patterns. So this one up here from Wenham, who I was just noting, who sees what we're looking at today as the C part here, 7, 1 to 4, and then part of the D part. So what we're doing is 7, 1 to 10 overlaps his C and his D part, which he's separating out by who's speaking here, divine monologue addressing Noah, and then narrative. So the narrator speaking rather than God speaking. But there's another way to look at it, as I have here, that this section 7, 1 to 10 is the second divine speech and includes entering the ark. And that's parallel on the other side with 8, 15 to 19, a third divine speech, leave the ark. So whichever way we want to look at it, there are three options. And we've also been exploring, and I'll bring that up here, some of the ways that our story here, is echoing stories from the Babylonian culture, whether that's the older versions or here from Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh. And also, again, scholars spend enormous amounts of energy arguing over which of the ancient Babylonian texts the Genesis authors are working from, depending upon what element is in the Babylonian text that's also in Genesis. I don't want to get us into the weeds of that, but I do want to highlight again that the Genesis authors, whether it's J, or call that non-P, or P, are both working from this, which suggests to me, and to many other scholars now, that both are writing from exile, a time when the Babylonian traditions would be relevant. And eventually we'll see this as a counter story, and some of that comes across, as you can see, in the theological contrast, which we'll look at when we finish this whole thing, and I'll create a video that's a summary and conclusion of the whole thing. But as we can see, for example, here, we've looked at several of the possibilities of the causes for flood, whatever ways we looked at, whether it's 6:1 to 4, 5 to 8, or 9 to 13, involves moral corruption of humanity as the cause of the flood, as opposed to in the Babylonian stories where humans are too noisy and causing a problem with the gods. Much like we see in Enuma Elish, that's parallel to the creation stories in the first 3 chapters. So, whichever author it is, they're writing against the Babylonian stories to teach their children or themselves a different understanding of who God is, what humans' relationship with God is, and what the earth's relationship is with that. But there's also parallels within Genesis between this story and the Sodom story, which we're going to get to eventually here. And I don't, this is not from scholarship, this is really just from my own observations, so I don't have a link to a source here, but hopefully you can see how these are connected. Each of them has specific agent of divine salvation. That's both Lot and Abraham, because we know before the Sodom story, Abraham will bargain with Yahweh about righteousness, but Lot will be the one to carry it out. Those proposed to be saved are the primary person, that person's wife, and then their children and spouses. So for Lot, it's sons and wives, and for Noah, it's sons and wives, and for Lot, it's daughters and husbands. The cause in both cases, consistent with the Bible but inconsistent with the Babylonian stories, is God responding to violence or destruction somehow, whether it's called sin or evil. That's what God is responding to. The key word issue of ruin and the Hebrew word shachet, hard to pronounce without vowels there, is a divine response. So we've already looked at that some, translated as corruption or destroy in 6:11 through 13. But here is what God's going to do. God sees that humans have destroyed the earth, so now as God is going to destroy the humans. And then that's the same word that's used many times, as you can see in the Sodom story in chapter 18 and 19, and only one other time in Genesis other than 13:10, which is simply the narrators saying this is before God had destroyed Sodom. The category of what makes people exempt in both cases is being tzaddik, righteous. So Noah, as we saw last time, is described as righteous. And Abraham asked Yahweh, what if there are righteous people in Sodom? And shouldn't the righteous be saved? The means of destruction is really an important one, and this is one we can miss here. And this is only from the J part we're going to see today that's described as rain of water, as opposed to flood. We'll see the fountains opening up, the undoing of the Genesis 1 separation of the waters. But we'll hear the use of rain here, the Hebrew mitter, and only used one other time in the Genesis, in the Eden story, where it says that there was no rain yet. And then this rain, if you will, of sulfur and fire. So using the word rain to describe sulfur and fire is plainly linking the Sodom story with the flood story. And then both there's a container that supposedly would protect from evil. The ark does protect Noah and the animals from the evil people out there, and we'll see more of that when we look at the Darren Aronofsky film, where you can really see the power of all those people, both their evil and their desperation, recognizing what's happening in their midst. And then Lot's house, which ends up not being protection, other than the fact that the angel of God, the messenger of God, uses some special power to make it as protection. But of course, it's not the long-term protection. The call is to leave Sodom behind. And then both have post-destruction action, where Noah plants a vineyard and gets drunk, and in the Sodom story, Lot's daughters get him drunk and have sex with him, which is a terrible scene that we'll get to when we get there. So all these things are overlapping those stories. So whether we're looking back to the stories that the people in exile inherited from their Babylonian cultural context, or the ones that Genesis authors wrote, again, as we'll see with Sodom, no more water, the fire next time, referencing James Baldwin, his quote from that. So I'm going to bring up the Hebrew here for a while so we can see some of the details, especially in these first couple of verses, which really question the traditional understanding of 7:1 to 5 as a Yahwist text. The plain initial reason for that is the use of Yahweh here. So the most basic structure of what separates the J, supposed J or now non-P text from the others is the name for God. So using Yahweh for God is traditionally understood as a different source from using Elohim for God. So in the previous section it was Elohim, or just God, said to Noah, and now it's Yahweh. Notice there's no instructions for building the ark. This passage assumes that there is an ark, or it assumes that the audience has read the first section. And this is one of those many places where scholars have to engage in all kinds of manipulations to deal with this. Whether the redactor, as Westerman suggests, left out that to make it fit, but if left it out of something we've never seen, we don't have a J text that has an instruction for building the ark that's being left out. So that's just a supposition. But if this were ever just a freestanding text, as it is, it's saying go into the ark like Noah knows what an ark is and it's already built. So certainly readers reading this know that the last verses described the improbable command to just build this gigantic thing out of wood to make the boards, etc. But now that's left behind for go into the ark. You and all your household, and this is the first time that the word bayit for household is used in Genesis. It'll be really important in the family story starting in chapter 12, but this is the first time we're seeing humanity with a household. We've seen obviously Adam and Eve, and then we saw patriarchs like Cain, and we saw some genealogies, but we've not actually seen a family so far. We're not going to see much of this family. Only Noah is going to speak. The sons will speak in the scene that follows later in chapter 9, but nobody else speaks throughout the flood story. So this is the first time we're hearing about the people being a household. And then Yahweh says, I have seen not the destruction so much, but his righteousness. And again, Zadik. So this is one of those questions. If the question of Noah being Zadik and his generation being the only righteous person, and that was a P text, then what's this doing in a J text? And generation, certainly the Hebrew dor, which is a standard P term, what is that doing in a J text? So certainly there's some more collaboration going on here, whether it's between the authors of these two stories or some later redactor who's editing them into place. These are not as purely separate as one might think. Not as purely separate as the animals that Noah is told to separate here in the next verse. And that's another issue of what the audience is expected to understand, or the absurdity of the story. So let's look at that here. Here the verb is take, a verb that we see often in the books of Samuel, because that's what kings do, to take. Notice how different this is from what we saw in the last passage in the P version, where it says the animals will come to you. Here Noah is told to take the animals, not a pair of each, but 7 pairs, and we'll look at that in a second, but of a new category, clean animals. So let's look at the 7 pairs, and this is where we're going to look at some of the Hebrew here on the screen. So if you can see here from this, there's no word for pairs. So we look at verse 2, there's 7, 7. And we see that same thing down here later in the verse. So 7 sevens, which is the way to say emphatic, 7, yes, 7, of all the clean animals, not pairs. The pair is implied by the fact that male and its mate. But male and its mate is not what it sounds like either, but we'll get there in a second. So back to clean animals. The word tahora for clean is only used here in this passage. It's one of those many words that I'll bring that up here that are Hebrew words found only in the flood story in Genesis. So here tahora, and we'll see in 7:4 to wipe out, is only in this passage. But the question here is, what makes something a clean animal? Nothing in Genesis has had this category so far. The category comes from Leviticus. And notice it's clean animals and not unclean animals, animals that are not clean. So let's take a pause for a moment and look at Leviticus 10:10, which is where we can really see this set out here. So you are to distinguish, Moses is passing on to the people through the voice of Yahweh, between the holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. And you're to teach the people of Israel all the statutes the Lord has commanded you. And as we'll see when we look at not clean here, the Hebrew word for not clean, tameh, is not found in Genesis. Tameh is 88 times in the Masoretic text, and 47 of those are in Leviticus, with another 19 in Numbers and Deuteronomy. So it's clearly a category in Leviticus, but it's not used here. And there are many speculations why it's not used here. The Midrash has, as the Midrash often does, a sly comment here. It's presented here as an effort to, quote, avoid uttering an unclean or indelicate expression, so a play on the uncleanness of the language by not using the word unclean. Casuto notes that the issue isn't unclean, but the absence of cleanness. That may be a distinction that a lawyer or a rabbi can understand more than an ordinary reader, but clearly the authors here of Genesis are avoiding that word. But the question of the category is one that's now assumed, that Noah knows what that is, and certainly the audience would know what that is. That's tended to be assumed is for sacrifice, and we'll see that in 8:20. I'll show you that now, that after the flood, Noah built an altar and took all the clean animals and every clean bird and offered them for sacrifice. Notice that there's no command to do this. The command is to take the animals with them. There's no reason given for this, that they're for sacrifice. So there's no particular reason that Noah is expecting to do that, and yet it happens. And we're going to be told that, as we see on the screen in verse 5, and Noah did all the Lord had commanded him, but he's also doing things, will do things that Yahweh or God has not commanded him, as we'll see. The language for male and his mate is really interesting and a little bit strange here, because I want to draw your attention to it. Here, although the interlinear translation in Bible Hub tends to follow the English translation rather than the literal Hebrew, you can see here from the transliterated Hebrew, Ish and Ishtav, which is to say a man and a woman, not male and female. And if I go down here a little farther, you can see the difference. So man and woman, Ish and Ishtav, is here and then repeated here. But down here, it's Zakar and Unaqueba, which is male and female. And we've looked at that before, and that's a very much a P kind of phrase, which is to say a male and female that applies to animals and in our cultural context, electrical outlets and plumbing. You know, anything that goes in or anything that receives something else that goes in can be male and female that way. But we don't tend to think of it as a man and a woman in English or normally in Hebrew either, except for human beings. We don't call female cats women. We call them either girls or just females. And the girl part is usually more out of pets. People don't refer to cows usually as a girl, unless that's my good girl cow. That's one that gives milk to you and you're happy with it. But I can assure you on a cattle ranch where they're breeding them for beef, they don't get too friendly with their cattle and call them socially friendly names like that. And that would be the role normally of male and female, simply distinguishing sex or gender. But here it's Ish and Ishtav, a man and a woman, and twice here in different regard the birds. So that's an interesting thing. That is the J sort of language that we see in the Garden of Eden story, but it's matched here with the P language that we normally see, like in Genesis 1, where God made people male and female in the image and likeness of God. So there's some mixing going on here that scholars who want to worry about those things have to struggle with without a clear answer. Notice that the birds are not described as clean or unclean, although Septuagint adds that to make that more parallel. And the New Revised Standard here is to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth, but literally to keep seed alive. And that's an important phrase. We'll see it also in chapter 19 at the end of the Sodom story. The sense of seed, which is what is common to all creatures that procreate, to plants and to animals and to humans. And of course, if you're not familiar with it, it should be clear that the English word sperm comes from the Greek word sperma for seed. Human seeds planted in female soil, so to speak. So here, keeping all alive. And it's really important to recognize that in contrast to the Sodom story, which is simply about human evil and the destruction of human beings, the flood story is as much concerned with keeping non-humans alive as humans alive. And as we'll see as we look later, especially when we look at indigenous perspective at the conclusion, on keeping the earth healthy, the earth apart from living creatures on it, but the earth itself. And maybe there's some implication to that in this phrase, the face of the earth, which is a very common phrase in Genesis and elsewhere, but usually translators cover it over with something like on the surface of the ground or simply on the ground. But as you can see from my note below, the face of all the earth is used a number of times, all the way back to Genesis 1, a couple of times in the flood story, and we'll see it also in the Tower of Babel story several times, and again elsewhere. And I'd like to at least suggest that it's something about the earth being an entity here. Like we saw in Genesis 1, that the earth responds to God's commands. The earth isn't being commanded here. Only Noah is being commanded. But the face of the earth is a player here, so to speak. And of course, we heard how the blood of Abel was crying out from the ground, and so not from the face looking, but we'll see that the earth is certainly an important factor, if not also a player in the Genesis scene. So Now we get something new. In 7 days I will send rain. In the P version we saw, it showed much more the undoing of Genesis 1, which is a P story. So that the fountains of the earth would burst open. In other words, the dome and the separation that took place in Genesis 1, separating the waters above, the Hebrew word for sky or heaven, Shemayim, literally means above the waters, between the waters. So the waters above the dome, the rakia, the dome of the sky, and the waters in the ground coming up, are going to be broken open, and that divider is going to be destroyed. But in this version, in this J version, it's rain that will fall, a giant rainstorm for 40 days and 40 nights. A phrase that we'll see again corresponding to the other time. This is the first 40 marker we're seeing in the Bible. And then we're going to see a command that makes it absolute, and we'll see in the fulfillment of it next time how this is played out in a poetic, if solemn, repetition. So every living thing that I have made, I will blot out from the face of the ground. And there's the face again. The word for blot we saw already in 6:7, and we'll see it in the fulfillment twice in 7:23. It's a word that could be translated as wipe out. I think that's how it's shown here in the interlinear. Actually, the interlinear just says I will destroy, which isn't so helpful. But blot out, just like blot in English, to wet something and to have it disappear. And now the earth is going to be wet, and all these living creatures will be disappeared. And Noah did all that Yahweh had commanded, echoing what we saw already in 6:22. So that's where we have to grapple with the question of the repetition. Any ordinary reader would recognize that he's been commanded, and we've been told he did what he was commanded multiple times. And then we get into an even more complex section. This is what I was saying at the beginning of how the J and the P, or the non-P and the P, are woven together here. And 7:6 to 11 forms itself a little chiasm, as you can see here. So the A and the A prime parts are around Noah being 600 years old when the flood of waters come, and you see on the repeat part, after 7 days the waters of the flood came on the earth in the 600th year of Noah's life. And then the B parts involve the entering the ark. So in the first B part, Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives enter the ark, and then the animals enter afterward, 2 and 2, male and female, with Noah. And then in the center is the clean animals, which is an interesting thing to feature here. Notice the chiasm is constructed out of both J and P elements. So, assuming there were separate texts that were woven together, there was no chiasm in either of the original versions, but there is in the final version. So certainly intelligence and intention is being exercised in putting these pieces together. Sometimes older scholars seem to talk about these authors is that they were sloppy in revealing these seams that modern scholars can recognize. But I think that's part of a implicit anti-Semitism that condescends, as well as looking back on older people from previous generations, as if they were inherently inferior to we enlightened, civilized people. But hopefully, as we've gotten to this point in our series, we're seeing that that's hardly the case. Our biblical authors were as smart and as sophisticated as any modern people. The 600 years here, apart from being parallel in the chiasm, can be a Babylonian play, as we've seen before, and we looked at in the genealogy in chapter 5, and we used Kasuto for that all the long age spans there were number plays on the Babylonian base 60 number system. And here, perhaps that's the case here, 10 times the base 60. And also perhaps playing on the Sumerian king list, which is the most ancient document here, which has kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. And again, we looked at that. We looked at the genealogy in chapter 5. So if you're not familiar, you can go back and look at that there. So Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth, and his sons and his sons, Noah with the sons and his wife and the sons' wives went into the ark. Escape isn't there in the Greek. Literally, they went before the face of the flood waters. So there's the face of the earth, and there's the face of the waters. And notice filling out the chiasm, the clean animals, the animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps in the ground went into the ark. Noah's not apparently having to gather them. They're going in 2 by 2. And as my note suggests on the surface, that may appear to contradict the 7 pairs, but could also simply be expressing the stately procession here as we watch as readers the procession of all these animals going into the ark as God commanded. And then, after the 7 days of preparation of getting it all ready, the waters of the flood came on the earth. And boy, the authors do not hold back anything in describing this flood. And we'll get there next time. See you then. Bye.